Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's program. We are about 2 minutes away from getting started. If you're just logging in, welcome. We're so glad that you're with us. Please leave a message in the chat. Let us know where you're logging in from, and we will get started in just about a minute. Okay, we have Hershey, Pennsylvania. For those of you logging in, welcome to today's Jewish Gen Talk. We're about a minute away from getting started. In the meantime, put a message in the chat. Please let us know where you're logging in from. And we have people from Norfolk, Virginia, San Diego, Santa Rosa, California, Portland, Oregon, Florida, Jerusalem, Israel. Welcome. Another person from Jerusalem, Richardson, Texas, New Hampshire, right here in New York City, Western Virginia, Beechwood, Ohio. Phil Goldfarb, our lead moderator for the discussion group. Welcome. Berkeley, California, Rocky River, Ohio, Berlin, Germany, Eileen Winkler, welcome. We have Suzanne from Seattle, Washington. Welcome to those of you who are logging in. Welcome to today's program. We are going to get started in less than a minute. In the meantime, please let us know where you're logging in from. You could put a message in the chat. We have people from Bethesda, Maryland, Saskatchewan, Central California, Hamilton, Ontario, Rockville, Maryland. We have Haifa in Israel, Cincinnati, Ohio, Boston, Massachusetts, Lexington, Naples, Florida, Jerusalem. The people from all over the world today joining for this program. And we are about to get started. Just get my screen set up here. Okay, welcome everybody. We're about to get started on today's very special Jewish Gen Talk with. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Avram Grohl, and I'm privileged to serve as Executive Director of Jewish Gen. We welcome you to today's Jewish Gen Talk, which is a very special talk focused on the life of our educated ancestors, Jews at American colleges. We are joined by Dr. Cynthia Gensheimer and Dr. Dan Oren, moderated by Karen Franklin. This talk will explore stories of American Jews who entered colleges and universities around the turn of the 20th century, what their integration into American society looked like by virtue of their education. The speakers, Dr. Owen and Dr. Gensheimer, have combined decades of experience focused on the American Jewish experience. Dr. Owen is the author, amongst others, of Joining the Club, History of Jews, and Yale. He is a volunteer president of the Friends of Jewish Heritage in Poland, an associate professor of psychiatry at Yale University, amongst others. Dr. Cynthia Francis Gensheimer is an economist and independent historian of 19th century American Jewish communities and philanthropists. She has a PhD from the University of California in Los Angeles. She analyzed tax policy for the Congressional Budget Office and has taught part-time at Vassar College for years. She today studies Jewish women, focusing on their education, their benevolent work, and their role as leaders within the Jewish community and beyond. Our moderator is Karen Franklin, is the former co-chair of Jewish Gen's Board of Governors, is well-known throughout the Jewish genealogy world, and is the current director of family research at the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. Just a couple of notes. We welcome questions. If you would like, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat. Please put questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to cover some of them at the end of the program. Please try to keep your questions general in nature so that they can be relevant to the entire audience. Second, if you'd like to stay informed of programs such as these, please make sure that you've registered for the Jewish Gen discussion group. You can do so by visiting the Jewish Gen homepage and clicking connect. If you are on Facebook, please join our Jewish genealogy portal, a wonderful group where, again, you can engage with others, ask questions, seek research advice, and stay informed of the various Jewish Gen programming that is occurring throughout the year. Without further ado, I now pass it over to my colleague, Karen Franklin.
Thank you, Rami, and welcome everyone, especially the people who are calling in from Israel, because it's past your bedtime over there. So we really appreciate that you are joining us today. Also, just to let you know that in this lecture, your interests are very important to our two researchers, and they welcome you to reach out to them after the talk. Their emails will be sent out in the follow-up email that you will receive for today's session. You help inform them about your own family's experiences. Now, I personally became interested in this topic for several research projects that I was doing. One was working with Williams College on researching their early Jewish students. And what I realized as I did this work, I had to identify who was Jewish, and I recognized so many of the names on the lists that I was going through, because many of them were our crowd sons and, well, not daughters at that time, but sons of our crowd people that I already had their family trees in my records. So that was one reason. Also, for a friend who I discovered that their ancestor went to Yale and graduated in 1872. But the punchline of that story is that they were 5 generations at Yale and continue to be part of the university. So with those two things in my background, that is, and the third reason is at my college reunion last year at Wellesley, which was sadly online, there was a lecture that I listened to driving up the highway with my husband in the car by Cynthia, talking about Jewish women at Seven Sisters schools. And I was mesmerized. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is my husband was sitting next to me, and the man who usually complains bitterly about all the lectures that I listen to was also mesmerized. So we thought perhaps you would be mesmerized by these lectures today as well. So welcome, Dan, and welcome, Cynthia. And my first question to you, and we'll start with Cynthia, is how you even became interested in this topic.
Well, can everybody see me and hear me? When I was about 10 years ago or so, I was a fellow at the American Jewish Archives, and I had been working on doing research on Jewish women and philanthropy and the benevolent work that they did. And I was studying mostly German Jewish women in America in the Midwest, and I could not understand their motivation in terms of why they were so interested in Jewish benevolent work when they didn't seem to be religiously observant to me. I came from an Eastern European background in terms of my ancestry, and even though my family was Reform, I was having trouble understanding. I knew that these women were religiously motivated, but couldn't really grasp it. And when I was at the American Jewish Archives, I spent weeks reading the letters written between Hannah Greenebaum Solomon, who was the president of and founder of the National Council of Jewish Women, and her daughter, Helen, who was spending her junior year at Wellesley in 1901 to 1902. These two had a fabulous relationship, and Helen wrote back to her mother, confiding in her and about anxieties that she had, and she was very witty also in writing, so I loved reading the letters. But Helen would tell her mother about a situation she'd found herself at this very Protestant women's college that made her feel awkward and how she had responded. And then she would say to her mom, "Isn't that right, Mom, or is that okay?" And Catherine Hellerstein was also a fellow there at the same time, and she and I were talking, and we collaborated on an article about Helen Solomon and her time at Wellesley College, which was 1901 to 1902. And I just got hooked. I loved Helen's stories, and every other person I've researched has been fascinating too.
Thank you, Cynthia. Dan, we're waiting to hear how you became interested in the topic.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Rami, for having me. I got interested in this about 46 years ago, in fact, exactly 46 years ago, when I was a sophomore in college, and it was the bicentennial year in the United States. And for those of you who were in the US and old enough to remember that time, it was a time of pride in America and in American history. And as a sophomore at Yale, that semester, the Yale Religious Studies Department had decided to have a course in American Jewish history. And to do that, they brought in a visiting professor from the Jewish Theological Seminary, Professor Lloyd Gartner, who was teaching at Tel Aviv University, but that semester in the US. And he was teaching this course where the students had the assignment the entire grade being based on a term paper of any subject of our choice in American Jewish history, as long as it was based, at least in part, on primary sources, because as all genealogists know, primary sources are what it's all about in terms of finding records. You can't just rely on the secondary sources, as important as they are. So for weeks, I was struggling trying to figure out what primary sources could I find? And I still remember we were assigned a book by the historian John Hyam, and the book was called Send These to Me. And there was one sentence in that book that jumped out to me when I read it. And that sentence said, in the late 1910s, beginning then, few Jews were admitted to fraternities at Yale and Princeton and elsewhere. And when I read that sentence, it was like a bolt of lightning, a shock hit me, because I was very lucky in that I had never personally experienced any significant anti-Semitism as a child. My parents were both immigrants from Israel in the post-war years. They came in the mid-1950s. So I grew up without the knowledge of difficult times and discrimination in American Jewish history. So the idea that once there had been a time at Yale and Princeton and the other major universities of discrimination against Jews, it was simply unthinkable in terms of 1970s Yale, which was a very open place, especially for Jews, and had a very significant Jewish undergraduate and faculty proportions. So at that point, when I realized there was a story, I decided to investigate it, and I got hooked on it in the way that Cynthia describes, and I couldn't get it out of my system until I wrote a book.
Thank you, Dan. And I should also mention, as I suggested, the connection to Yale that I had with my client. It was at that time, many years ago, that I read your book about the Jews at Yale, and meeting you through our genealogy community. It wasn't until a few months ago that I said to myself, wait, our Dan Oren was that Dan Oren? And so what's so nice about this topic is that we connect the records and how you use the records with this topic itself. So with that introduction, I'm going to go back to Cynthia. And Cynthia, I know I've asked each of you to talk about two of your favorite students whom you studied and worked on, and showing the resources that you used to sketch out their family histories and their stories.
Well, I'll begin by saying this was a very difficult task for me. It's like asking me to talk about two of my favorite children when I have three, or which is my favorite grandchild. But if I speak enthusiastically about this subject, it's because I am very enthusiastic about it. When you look back at the first Jewish women in America who went to college, they were almost uniformly extremely smart, extremely spunky, and boy, did they have grit. They had to have grit because it was very tough for a woman in America to go to college. Very few did. And it was even harder for Jewish women to convince their parents that they should be able to go to college. As late as 1913 or so, only about 1 in 1,000 college. Christian men went to college about double those rates. Jewish men went to college at about double the rates of Christian men, but Jewish women went to college at about half the rates of Christian women. And that may be a little hard to follow, but basically what you're hearing is that Jewish parents, for a variety of reasons, did not want to send their Jewish daughters to college. One obstacle that the women faced was cost. It was expensive. If they were from an immigrant family, especially, their parents needed the money that they would make, their, what I would call as an economist, their foregone wages. And they in order to get into an elite women's college, they had to pass difficult entrance examinations, to know Latin or Greek, to have studied a lab science and mathematics. All of these subjects were outside the normal college preparatory curriculum. And even, pardon me, we're not part of the average high school curriculum. And so the parents were worried most about the fact that if they sent their daughters to college, they might never marry and they might lose their attachment to Judaism. So Jewish parents wanted to keep their daughters close to home. But could I have the first slide, please? I'm going to talk about, I did choose two women to talk about today. One of them is Clara Landsberg. And I'm going to use these women. I'm going to talk, because you're genealogists or interested in genealogy, I'm going to talk about how they, I'm going to talk about how I use the records available through college archives to inform my research. I chose Clara Landsberg because in some ways, she's a perfect example of a German Jewish student who went to college early on. She was in the Bryn Mawr class of 1897. She was born in Rochester, New York in 1873 to parents who were newly arrived from Germany. Her father was a Reform rabbi in Rochester, and he hoped to bring what he considered a perfect version of Reform Judaism to the United States. He disliked all kinds of orthodoxy, and he discarded any kind of ritual that he felt was outmoded and anything that he thought was just a superstition. So Clara's family would not have kept kosher. There would have been people in his congregation who celebrated Christmas. But the Landsbergs were very religious according to their definition of religion, and Clara's mother was a leader in the American Jewish community. Their basic premise was that America was the promised land for Jews, and they should encounter no obstacles to being fully American. And by the same token, this was their home, and they should be able to join clubs that they wanted to. They should be able to go to any kind of college they wanted to. And so Clara was sent off to Bryn Mawr College in the class of 1897. Her older brother had gone to the University of Rochester. In this photo, Clara is the one on the far left. She was the eldest of three sisters. And her older brother had studied abroad in Germany briefly, and then he completed his college education at the University of Rochester, which is my alma mater. But Clara didn't have that option because the University of Rochester was not then open to women students. And Jewish women in Rochester played a large role in making the college open to women, but that's kind of a separate story. So Clara's parents both spoke fluent English, and Clara grew up in a very refined household. Next slide, please. So when she got to Bryn Mawr, Bryn Mawr was founded by Quakers. She was the only Jewish student in her class of about 50. There were a few Quakers there. Even though it was founded as a Quaker college, there weren't enough Quaker women who were interested in going there. So the class was composed almost exclusively of Presbyterians and Episcopalians. And one of those, Margaret Hamilton, became Clara's lifelong partner. Margaret had grown up, her father's family had founded the Presbyterian church in their small town in Indiana, and her mother liked the Episcopalian church they went to in summers at Mackinac Island. So based on clues unearthed by other scholars, I discovered that Clara Landsberg converted and became an Episcopalian soon after she graduated from Bryn Mawr College. Even so, she was turned down to teach at an exclusive private girls' school in Baltimore because she was Jewish. She went to Chicago to live at Hull House, where for 20 years, her room was directly next to that of Jane Addams, and she had a remarkable career as teacher, pacifist, and social worker. Details of how I pieced together this story will be in the next issue of Chicago Jewish History. But I used some of the, without the records that I found at Bryn Mawr College, it would have been very difficult to piece together Clara's story. Most of these colleges assemble a dossier on each graduate and periodically send questionnaires to the graduates asking such things as what they have done professionally, what schools they went to after they graduated from college, and so forth. And so I was able to read in Clara's own handwriting, in her own words, exactly what she had done year by year after she graduated from Bryn Mawr College. I understood from reading that the work that she did at Hull House, she considered volunteer work because she had a separate place where she was supposed to write down her paid employment. And while she was doing this volunteer work, which was teaching mostly Jewish immigrants to read and speak and write English, she was spending her days teaching probably upper class American-born girls German at a private girls' school. So Clara's story is unusual. Most Jewish graduates of these colleges did marry and did remain Jewish, though their horizons were broadened at college. Next slide, please. Rather than show you Clara's transcript from Bryn Mawr College, I show you that of Gertrude, and she pronounced her last name Wheel. She was a famous suffragist from North Carolina. She graduated from Smith College in the class of 1901. She has a fascinating story, which I don't have time to tell you about, but I show you this transcript because of all of the information that it contains. And this predates the time when colleges started trying to figure out whether students were Jewish. So at this point, you can see the name of the maiden name of her mother, and her father's name, her father's occupation, where Gertrude prepared for college, and her denominational preference, which she wrote down as Jewish. Not all Jewish applicants. I happen to be in the peculiar situation of knowing too many of these students. So I know that some left that line blank. Some wrote down that they were Unitarians. Some wrote down that they were Reformed Jewish to differentiate themselves from immigrants. But there's a lot of information on a college transcript, and I just show that to you so that you see how much you can learn from that. You have to contact the college and explain what your relationship is to the student whose file you'd like to view, and each college has its own rules and regulations concerning that. Next slide, please. Ruth Sapinski went to Wellesley College, and she graduated in 1910. She said later that she was one of 30 Jewish students there at that time out of a student body of 1,400. Her parents were from Lithuania, but her father was at this point a fairly well-to-do merchant in New Albany, Indiana, right across the river from Louisville, Kentucky. She had a brother at Harvard, which definitely influenced her parents, I'm sure, and helped overcome their reluctance at sending her so far away to college. And Ruth gave us a huge gift because she wrote a memoir about her time at Wellesley College. And my favorite line from that memoir is her describing the reaction of some of her non-Jewish classmates to meeting a Jew for the first time. It's as though they expect me to heave a water jug to my shoulders and stride barefoot down the road, singing something from the Psalms. So Ruth witnessed anti-Semitism at Wellesley College, but still her husband, after her death, wrote to the college and said these were the best years of her life. She got a terrific education there. She became a writer, and she helped her husband, who was the editor of the Menorah Journal and a national Jewish leader in his own right. So I came across a wonderful find recently. Ruth, as almost all college women who attended college around this time did, kept a scrapbook or a photo album. And these are incredibly helpful and help us fill in the blanks. It's one thing to look at a ship's manifest or a census record, but when you find a scrapbook, to me, it's as if you've struck it rich. You've discovered gold. And what's interesting about this, there are two photos side by side, and this is just one page of there are about 100 pages in this scrapbook. But on the left, you'll see a photo of 3 Wellesley students, and Ruth has written, "Don't they look good? They're going to chapel." And right next to that, she's pasted a photo of the Wellesley Inn, and what she's written there is, "I wonder if they have ever heard of the Wellesley Inn fudge cake." So in other words, being Jewish for Ruth Sapinski was a part of her college experience, but it wasn't the defining experience. Next slide, please. And I just included these next few photos to give you a sense of how much fun. By 1910, some people were going to college for the experience. So you can see Ruth here, she's wearing a fringed hat and she's dressed up, she's in a play, and she wrote, her caption was, "I am a Spanish lover." So the girls played roles of boys, and Ruth there is playing the role of a Spanish lover in this play. And in the next slide, you'll see Ruth took courses in economics and sociology. These were courses that especially appealed to women at all colleges, I would say, and from what I can tell, Jewish women in particular. They were studying social problems because their mothers, for the most part, were involved in benevolent work through their sisterhoods and their Jewish benevolent societies. They were setting up programs to Americanize immigrant newcomers, or else they were immigrants themselves and familiar with the problems of immigrants. For whatever reason, Ruth took courses, and then she volunteered to work at the Denison settlement in Boston. And in her scrapbook, she included photos of some of the children who were in her course at the settlement. This is on a day she took them on an outing. So you can see how her coursework and her extracurricular activities were, to a certain extent, connected. And Ruth learned to be an excellent writer when she was at Wellesley. And afterwards, her husband, I think I told you, was the editor of the Menorah Journal. He was also a co-founder of the Menorah Society when he was a student at Harvard. And Ruth helped him with his, I think, sort of behind the scenes work with the Menorah Journal. She wrote quite a bit on her own. That memoir that I told you that she wrote about her time at Wellesley College was published in the Menorah Journal. So her Wellesley experience prepared her for the rest of her life. Her 10th reunion book has a wonderful quotation in it. So at these women's colleges and more at colleges more generally, students would write in periodically with updates for their alumni magazines or bulletins. And Ruth did that. She bragged about her husband for the most part. She bragged about her children. And she was rather self-effacing and about her own accomplishments, although she managed to convey them to a certain extent. And she had a wonderful sense of humor. And this is my favorite quotation of hers that she sent into a reunion booklet. This was for her 10th reunion when she was a young mother. She wrote, "A list of the things in which I'm dabbling this year, and this year is typical: music, social reform, literature, baby training, husband training, lion taming." So the next slide, please. Now, most of us are not descended from women who went to the Seven Sisters colleges, the ones I'm writing about for my book. So I thought I would show you a record. This is on called a biographical record at the University of Rochester. And this is the record of a German Jewish woman who lived at home and went to the University of Rochester. Her name was Mamie Greisheimer, no relationship to Cynthia Gensheimer. But you can see all of the information that she supplied to the university. It gives her married name, her maiden name, her husband's name, the date of their marriage, the names of their children. And at many colleges and universities, the colleges that the children went to are also spelled out. It gives her graduation class. She was in Phi Beta Kappa. She was a member of a sorority. That's all listed there too. And for me, the real bonus of this particular alumni file was that letters that she had written to her classmates when she and her husband, she married a Zionist from Chicago. They lived in Palestine in the 1920s, and letters that she wrote to her classmates are included in her alumni file. So that was a real find. There are other records that I can talk to you about if there are questions. There's student correspondence, student diaries, digitized student publications, and yearbooks, all of which have wonderful finds for the genealogist. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer questions later.
Cynthia, thank you. That was fabulous. And you made me think of something I had never thought about before, which was my great-grandfather was president of the Jewish Hebrew Orphan Asylum in Philadelphia. And among their vacation photos are dozens of photos of the orphans on the beach in Atlantic City. I guess they accompanied them there as part of their social service. I'll post them because it could be that descendants of the orphans have no other photos of their ancestors. Dan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Karen. Let me put up the first slide and sorry for the delay. In a second. There we go. Okay, so I am going to share with you some material. I'm going to try not to overlap in terms of resources with the kinds of resources that Cynthia excellently described. There are, as you noted, parallel resources at so many colleges across the country. What I will try to do in this a few minutes is to share with you some anecdotes about a few Yale graduates in particular, who I mentioned in joining the club. This book's now out of print, but you can still get it from Amazon and other reputable publishers. And what I hope to do is really just introduce some ideas to stimulate questions for later in the discussion or for you to think about in your own research down the road. So since this is a genealogy group today, I'm going to start with a genealogical slide. This is a small sample from the huge family tree of the famous Lehman family. And again, to any Lehman members of the family or descendants who may be watching who aren't part of this tree, you are. There was only space enough for a small number for this afternoon's purposes. So this tree begins back in Germany with Abraham Lou Lehman and his wife Eva, who had several children, including the three of their famous sons who founded Lehman Brothers: Henry Lehman, Emanuel Lehman, and Meyer Lehman. And again, just to focus on a few names distantly in the family, I'm going to talk about briefly Herbert Lehman, the famous governor and later senator of New York, son of Meyer and Babette. Arthur Lehman, who ended up being a major player in founding the Federation, the Council of Jewish Philanthropies in New York City. Arthur Lehman Goodheart, famous law scholar, and Robert or Bobby Lehman, who led Lehman Brothers for many years and was especially well known for being chairman of the board, the first chairman of the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and donated very generously toward that museum. And I'm going to begin with the slide that Karen was kind enough to share with me, which I think sets some background for any real thinking about the experience of Jews. Herbert Lehman was in 1896, he was a young college student at Williams, I believe, and his mother, Babette, wrote this letter to him, which reads, "Dear Herbert, let me know if you have enough winter clothing and winter socks. And be very careful, dear Herbert, with shoes. one should constantly only wear sturdy shoes. Signed, Mama or Mama. So when I look at this, what makes this so powerful, besides bringing a smile to my face and to perhaps many of your faces, is that if you think about what Jewish students in college, as we're here to talk about tonight, first, before anything, these are students, these are kids, these are young men and young women who are children and, or maybe just on the cusp of adulthood, but people who before anything else, they're themselves as people. So when you think about what was the story and what was the experience of our educated ancestors, they were experiences of people, of individuals, not just streams of Germans or East European Jews or Sephardic Jews passing through. And when I read a statement like this, although my own mother of blessed memory, I don't recall her ever saying anything to me about wearing sturdy shoes. I certainly have memories in my mind of her telling me how to dress. And I know for a session like this with a distinguished audience from around the world who are all taking significant amounts of your time out to join us this afternoon, this evening, maybe some of you are even kind enough to donate money to Jewish Gen to support this. My mother would be saying to me, here, even though Dan, you're in Israel where nobody wears a suit and a tie and a coat unless they're the prime minister, you got to dress up for people because this is an important occasion. So that's what parents do. That's what mothers do. So think, and this has nothing to do with being Jewish. It has to do with being a parent and being a person. So let's focus on the topic for this evening, which is our educated ancestors at the turn of the century. The 1890s in America was a time when fraternities were becoming exclusive. They'd always been for the elite, but they were starting to close their doors specifically to Jewish students, not only Jews, but Jews especially. And it was in reaction to that closing of doors that a fraternity was founded at Yale and called Pi Lambda Phi, the Alpha chapter, in March of 1895. Now, I'd encourage people to think for a second, why did students join fraternities in the first place? Well, at some universities, they provided the only reasonable place to have regular meals. And if you were an on-campus student, you needed to eat. You couldn't just go home and have your dinners and your breakfasts at home. Fraternities for most students were for the good life, a social community, and perhaps a hope they would be a ticket to the world of college and the world beyond. And sometimes it would happen, and people didn't join for this reason, sometimes it would happen that fraternities would be a natural place where men could meet the sisters of their frat brothers and end up marrying them. And you can be sure that in that era, most of the Christian students at Yale and throughout the Northeast did not want their sisters to be marrying young Jewish men. So at Yale, where there was a culture almost totally, not 100%, but almost totally excluding Jews from fraternities, in 1895, 3 Jewish students got together and founded the first chapter in this country of Pi Lambda Phi. Louis Samter Levy, Frederick Manfred Werner, Henry Mark Fisher. Levy had some Sephardic and German ancestry. Werner and Fisher had German Jewish ancestry. Together, they decided that there should be a non-sectarian fraternity, not that there should be a Jewish one, but that they should set a new standard of how people should behave towards each other and welcome collegial students and fun students in based on who they were, not based on their religious background. In other universities, different approaches were taken. 3 years later, at City College in New York, the first chapter of Zeta Beta Tau was founded. And what most people, even Zeta Beta Tau members, don't realize is that those letters ZBT actually stand for text from the book of Isaiah, Tzion b'mishpat tipadeh. And if you don't know what that means and you're interested, you can look it up online or ask me in the questions. But as an example of sometimes Jews getting into the fraternities, one can give the example of Joseph L. Seligman from the Yale class of 1908. Astute students of American Jewish history may recognize the name Joseph Seligman because this Joseph Seligman's grandfather in 1877 found himself at the center of a national scandal. His grandfather was a German Jew, a famous, very successful American financier. And when he went to a hotel in Saratoga Springs, he found himself and his family excluded and unwanted. And this created national headlines national discussion and was really a prominent embarrassment for the United States at that time. But his grandson, Joseph L. Seligman, was accepted into the Psi Upsilon fraternity, also known as the prestigious Fence Club at Yale. Another name from that era, Waldo Frank, BA and MA from Yale in 1911. Here in his family tree, you can see his Waldo's grandfather back in Germany, Joseph Frank, and his wife Emilie. Waldo's father came to America, Julius Joseph Frank, and there's Waldo Frank. Now, Waldo Frank was an intellectual of sorts, and when he was going to college, he thought he'd attend the University of Heidelberg in Germany, but his older brother warned him against it. He said to him, "You're an American, aren't you? You've got to get trained to live in America." He replied, "All right, I'll go to Harvard." His brother said, "Harvard would be almost as bad as Heidelberg. I want you to go to a college which believes in America and loves America, which models citizens to be and act American." And I want to make this point. This is a critical point for so many, particularly going to the colleges of the Northeast. They were going to college not just for an education, but to learn how to be. And who were these American Jews of German descent? Children and grandchildren of Jews who looked for a better life economically and socially in the golden land of America. They knew why their ancestors had left, and they could read or hear about the troubles of their East European compatriots who stayed behind. Another name to bring up, Robert Moses. His parents were Emanuel Moses and Belle Cohen. Emanuel had been born back in Germany. Emanuel was a department store owner in New Haven of German Jewish descent, and his mother, Bella Cohen. He grew up in New Haven. Now, let me just, as a source of information, encourage people to look all about. You may have seen this article just this Sunday in the New York Times describing how New Haven is more than just academics and pizza and mozzarella, celebrating the rebirth of New Haven after troubled years. But what many people don't realize is that at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, New Haven was one of the wealthiest cities in America, with much of that coming from industry led by German Jews or German Jewish descendants. And if we look back at that time, we can see actually the Moses household. This is a map provided to me by the New Haven Museum, and you can see the Moses family property on the map right on Dwight Street in about the year 1890. This is a modern version of the New Haven map taken from Google Maps, and you can see the location of the same house. Today it's numbered 169 Dwight Street in New Haven. And I point out on this map, I'll superimpose the old 1888 and 1890 map on this modern map, and you can see it fits in just perfectly. You see the Moses household right there. And I show this map because it was literally, Robert Moses grew up 1-2 blocks away from Yale University. For those of you who've been to New Haven, you can see the University Theater, the Branford Court of Harkness Tower, the old campus where most of the freshmen live, the famous Sterling Memorial Library. And the Jewish students, first they were German, and later down here on the southern part of this map, in this whole area at the bottom of the picture, was the area where East European Jews would come and move in. So it was natural that Jewish students would want to flock to the nearby school that they could get into. And this happened certainly at Columbia, it happened at Harvard, it happened wherever there were, it happened at Penn, wherever there were heavy Jewish concentrations near a university. Jewish students would see that they, before quotas, and certainly in the 1900s, early 1900s, it was before quotas, they could see that they could get into school quite easily. And then when Robert Moses' mother inherited New York property, she had the family move to East 46th Street in Manhattan, where their family, though wealthy, was among the less wealthy of the art crowd set. His mother wore the pants in the family and clearly influenced Moses to be rather an anti-religious person. She was anti-circumcision, anti-Jewish education, anti-bar mitzvah, and she enrolled the family in the New York Society for Ethical Culture. Moses was accepted to Yale at age 17, and he graduated in 1909. Running and swimming at Yale, he was in the varsity teams. He fought to share He fought to secure a share of football revenue for minor sports. However, he was a non-fraternity man. He wasn't accepted to fraternities and largely a brilliant loner at Yale. After college, he converted to being an Episcopalian and eventually became the immensely successful and today often thought controversial man who perhaps more than anyone else in the United States remade a city in his public works image. The last family I want to just to show you, this is the house that Robert Moses grew up in, and this is the value of looking at maps and looking at buildings. This is a photo of the house today, and the same house where Robert Moses grew up in, but I can guarantee that almost no one in New Haven walks by that house has a clue that one of the most famous Americans in the world ever lived there. Let's go back to the Lehman family and pick two more people from this era. Arthur Lehman Goodheart, born in 1891, and his second cousin, Robert Lehman, also born in 1891. Here's a photo and a painting of them later in life. Robert Lehman was a Hotchkiss School graduate. Coming from a wealthy background, he went to a private school. He graduated from Yale in 1913, got into the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity. He was managing editor of the school paper, which was a major social honor. Senior year, he was elected class treasurer and remained so for many years. Classmates must have thought he knew how to manage money, and he eventually led Lehman Brothers for decades. But as others have noted, his lengthy front page obituary in the New York Times, quote, mentions Hotchkiss and Yale, his stable of racehorses, and his world-class art collection, whose Rembrandts and El Grecos are now in Metropolitan Museum's Robert Lehman wing. The word Jewish doesn't appear once in that obituary. His second cousin, Arthur Lehman Goodheart, BA 1912, also attended Hotchkiss and then Yale. At Yale, he edited the campus humor magazine, the Yale Record, and he was managing editor of the prestigious literary magazine. An academic type, he later went on to a distinguished career at Yale, Cambridge, and then Oxford universities. And he was the first American to be a master of an Oxford college, and he was a significant benefactor to University College at Oxford. I want to provide a Jewish insight into their background based on interviews that I conducted 40 years ago with Norman Weinstein from the Yale class of 1914. He recalled that in the early 1910s, some students, including him, tried to organize a Jewish club to consider intellectual issues pertaining to Jewish life. Yale was an intellectual campus, so an intellectual Jewish club seemed a proper fit to Weinstein and friends. They approached virtually all the other Jewish students on campus. In those days, about 50 of the 1,300 Yale College students, that's 4%, were Jewish, so it wasn't a large group and it was easy to reach out to 50 people. There was great concern, however, from many, that Jews would be accused of self-segregation, and men seeking to fit into the big world of Yale and American commerce did not want to risk being accused of self-segregation. They wanted a group that wouldn't call much attention. So to decide if there should be such a group, they all met off campus in Mishkan, Israel, a Reform synagogue near the campus. The House of Yale Jews was divided. Some wanted a Jewish group, some were staunchly opposed. Lehman and Goodheart led the opposition. They believed that college was time to break the restrictive bonds of the past. They had successfully merged into the Yale social scene, and they feared a separatist Jewish organization. Lehman spoke then. He said, "Can't we be freed of Jewish problems? Can't we have 4 years of happiness?" Unquote. He was surely afraid of being trapped in the Jewish identity. And as some have written, he was excluded later in life from some important social clubs in the business community because of his background. Of course, such feelings were not unique to Lehman and Goodheart and wealthy Jews of German background. I heard similar sentiments in college 45 years ago from East European Jews, and I'm sure they're still occurring today. The challenge of Jews finding the non-Jewish world immensely exciting and tempting was true in biblical days and is universal in time. I'd like to make one very last point. What was the effect of social discrimination on the lives of our educated ancestors? Well, first of all, for most of them, it wasn't academic discrimination. Before the 20s, Jews at Yale and elsewhere were not excluded, essentially because of quotas. The classroom was generally a place of fair play. What largely happened was on the social level, and how one responded largely determined one's fate in college and life. Let me return to another branch of the Lehman family tree to illustrate this lesson. I learned from one Yale alum who graduated a few decades later in 1943, and this is the family tree, or a bit of it, of Fred Hirschhorn Jr., whom I interviewed almost 40 years ago on this subject. When I met with him, his daughter was present, he recalled some of the social fraternity genteel anti-Semitism he had previously encountered as a freshman at Wesleyan, and then to a much lesser degree at Yale. At Yale, he became the first Jew in that era to join the prestigious DKE fraternity. He recalled that many of his Jewish peers let fears of exclusion keep them from even trying to join various social outlets. As he put it, quote, they let the chips on their shoulders become blocks. What Fred was saying in today's terminology was that those who let social anti-Semitism get themselves discouraged had not learned resilience. In today's perspective, I would note that resilience is perhaps the most Jewish lesson of all of history. I speak today to you from Israel, from Jerusalem, where I know some of you are right now, a small Jewish nation whose Jewish ancestry has proved amazingly resilient from pogroms and Holocaust, and today has one of the strongest economies and militaries in the world, along with being a leader in culture. As Jews, we recall each Passover how once we were slaves in Egypt, but we have survived and we thrive. American colleges were founded to guide American youth as much in how to be as in what to know, maybe even more so in how to be. I would argue that we all have chips on our shoulders over the various slights that we experience over the course of a lifetime. But I think what our educated ancestors who succeeded and did not give up along the way learned was, as Fred Hirschhorn said, not to let the chips on their shoulders become blocks. And therefore, in my last slide, in my own personal family tree disclosure, I end with showing my daughters in 2011 in front of the pyramids in Egypt, jumping in the air for joy, celebrating that quintessential Jewish theme of resilience. We were slaves in Egypt, but we are free people now. Thank you.
Dan, Cynthia, brilliant. Thank you so much. There are numerous wonderful questions that have come in. So I know we have a somewhat limited time to answer them, but Avrami has given us permission to go slightly over time to answer as many as possible. People should not feel responsible, but just remember, I'll take your names if you go off before, no, just kidding, 4 o'clock. But please feel welcome to stay while our speakers answer the questions. What I'd like to do is pose 4 or 5 of them and then let you choose from them which ones you would like to answer. One of the questions, and there are many more good ones which you can peruse or I can give you. One was if there is material on fraternities, on Jewish fraternities, that's available. I know I have some in my personal collection that my grandfather kept from his fraternity, which was important because it was right before the Second World War, and it included quite a bit on refugees. But question about where material on fraternities might be available. Did college newspapers have anything that could be helpful in terms of tracing these students and their activities? What do you do if you don't know for sure which college someone might have attended? And I would add the definition of a Jew. What do you, if you don't know for sure that they're Jewish? If you're looking from the historian's point of view, not a family's point of view. And Cynthia, one of the questions was, when will your book be published? We can't wait. Cynthia, you start.
I'll take a couple of those. Marianne Sanua has written 2 wonderful books about Jewish fraternities, and I should have pulled them from, you can see all the books on my bookshelves behind me. I can't remember. I think one is called Going Greek, but she does a very thorough job of tracing the history of Jewish fraternities. Newspapers, school newspapers are a terrific source, but they can be very slow going. The alumni magazines are a wonderful source too. In a Smith Alumni Quarterly, I found a terrific account written of a woman whose father was a minister, and she wrote maybe 40 years after she graduated from Smith that her roommate had been the daughter of a Jewish rabbi, And on the first Friday night, this woman from Maine, who had never met a Jew except for one peddler before she went to Smith, walked into her college dorm, and she saw her roommate muttering something in a language she had never heard before and lighting candles, and she thought the roommate had gone crazy, and so she ran out of the room to talk to the house mother. But there is an awful lot in both of those sources. Barnard College newspaper is available in digitized form. They're increasingly being digitized, so I would definitely suggest that you try to find them. The 1940 census, in case people don't know, asks people what the highest level of education that they had attained was. And so if they graduated from college, it said C-4, and that's a big tip. Ancestry has many college yearbooks digitized now. So if you search for a person's name and you might be lucky and find it there on Ancestry. Otherwise, my advice would be to look as close as home to possible. For Jewish women, they might have gone to normal school or to a public university. As I said, their parents didn't want them to go far away. So I would look at the universities in the person's hometown, start there, and hope that you find your ancestor. In terms of the question, when is my book going to be written? I think that must have been my husband who submitted that question because he felt a long time ago that I had done enough research, but you can probably tell I love to do the research. And Clara Landsberg is going to be my sample chapter because she illustrates so well the issues that confronted Jewish women at college early on.
Dan, did you want to take any of these on?
One point about where to search for information. I mean, we all love the internet because it puts everything at our fingers, but the reality is that not everything is yet on the internet, and not everything is easily found on the internet. And certainly in my work, making friends with archivists was the most valuable thing. And my favorite people in the world, outside of my own family, of course, are the archivists who I've worked with and helped. A good archivist can help lead you to many findings. So if you're interested in a particular university, go to that university's archives and in person. And now that COVID is ending, find a way to get there in person and ask the archivist, because they really live they get genuine joy in helping researchers. So it's really a win-win situation, and I encourage people to do that.
Excellent. Two more questions to take on. Three actually. One is, when did Jewish women begin in large numbers to attend university? And I suppose the same could be asked for Jewish men as well. Second of all, there were more questions about quotas, just in general, and medical school quotas as well. And the third is, what would be relevant from your research to the situation today with Jewish students attending universities?
Could I take the first two questions, and maybe Dan, I'll let you take the last one and add anything you want to the first two. Jewish women started attending colleges in large numbers, not until the 19-teens, I would say. And that was because when the Eastern European immigrants came to the United States, they were very, very hungry for education, and the women were assertive and anxious to be educated also. I have one example. Actually, someone's told me about this example just yesterday from Israel. He said that his aunt, Anna Kallet, came to the United States in 1908 from Lithuania, from Suwalki. And a year later, she was enrolled at Wellesley College as a special student, and she graduated with the class of 1913. So that is one example of many. That's an extreme example of how determined Eastern European Jewish women were to become college educated. And of course, their numbers, the Eastern European numbers, about 2 million coming to the United States, between 1881 and maybe 1920 or so. Their numbers were so large that they dwarfed the earlier German Jewish immigrants and their children. So it was those people who came, who went to public universities, lived at home, and swelled the numbers. Quotas, we could talk, we could give a whole college course on quotas. I have found evidence of highly anti-Semitic college administrators, and my work just piggybacks on that of women like Helen Lefkowitz Horowitz, who wrote about M. Carey Thomas at Bryn Mawr College, but Virginia Gildersleeve at Barnard was very anti-Semitic. At Wellesley had an anti-Semitic president, Mildred McAfee, as well. But the problem really started arising, again, it was one of numbers. As long as Jews constituted just a few members of each class, and they were upper class German Jews who were well-mannered and tried to blend in and not rock the boat, no college really objected to their presence. It was just when Jews started coming in and being very noisy and threatening by their presence, by their numbers, threatening to discourage parents from allowing of the kind of students that the colleges wanted to attract. Once those parents got discouraged from sending their kids there, in the first place this happened was really Columbia, because of the proximity of so many New York Jews and the ease that they had of attending Columbia. That's when the college administrators started getting nervous, and in the Seven Sisters schools, they started talking among themselves about numbers of Jewish students. They exchanged statistics, and Harvard, of course, in 1920 famously debated the issue, and the president, Lowell, instituted a quota. The women's colleges were much more circumspect. They learned their lesson from the Harvard example. But after World War II, New York State and Massachusetts passed legislation that made it illegal to ask questions of applicants as to what their religion was. So it was no longer allowed to be explicit. What the colleges tried to do was impose geographical distributions and say that they were interested in a diverse student body, and that way they could look for students who weren't Jewish and limit the numbers that way. Certainly medical schools were notorious. My father told me a story that he could never forget. One of his closest friends was absolutely brilliant, graduated from the at the very top of his college class, and was denied admission to medical school, went into World War II and was killed as a medic on the front lines in a very heroic way. So we all know stories about quotas in medical schools and colleges, elite and otherwise. But I don't know, Dan, what you'd like to add.
Well, I think you've covered most of the quotas. I just would make two small additional points. One is that such things as the Scholastic Aptitude Test, the SAT tests, were originally instituted because it was thought that these tests would be capable of identifying the right kind of student, and they thought it would exclude undesirables, such especially Jews, although maybe some immigrant Catholics and Italians as well. And these informal quotas were supported not just by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but Jews themselves. Not necessarily most Jews, but there were a good number of elite Jews, some of them of German Jewish background, who did not want to go to a college or that had too many Jews. And in fact, for example, at Yale, the dean of the medical school from 1920 to 1935, Milton Charles Winternitz, was Jewish himself. And he was the one who instituted the Jewish quota because he didn't want his medical school to become too Jewish. I should also say he also instituted the quota on women and the quota on Blacks at Yale Medical School.
Wow. I think we should probably end it here, but not without an enormous amount of thanks to both of you. I mean, the research is fascinating. Its connection and relevance to all of our work is intimate and profound. And I will turn it back to Rami, but just really with our gratitude to you. And my suspicion is I hope that all of you will, in fact, perhaps continue the discussion on the Jewish Gen discussion group, because some of the things that you've put into the question and answer and the chat are really wonderful, and we don't have a chance to take a look at it all and answer all the questions, and they make great discussion group additions. So thank you very much. And Avrami, it's all yours.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Again, thank you to Dr. Oren, to Dan, and to Cynthia. This was a wonderful conversation and very elucidating and informative presentation. I think everybody has enjoyed and found it very interesting if you look at the comments in the chat. And we thank everybody who joined us today. We invite you to join us for our next program, which will be next week on Wednesday, June 15th. The topic is The Ships of Our Ancestors. The speaker is Hal Bookbinder. You can learn more and register by visiting JewishGen.org/live. This session has been recorded and will be put on our Jewish Gen YouTube channel within the next couple of weeks, if not sooner. And we thank you again for joining us. Thank you again to our speakers. Have a wonderful rest of the day.